Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Jana and I lead the UN Innovation Network. And this webinar today is brought to you by the UN Generative AI Practice Group, which was launched in early 2023 and is convened by colleagues from the UN Data Strategy community. You'll see here on the screen there, as well as colleagues from UNDPPA and UNICEF. And as generative AI is really kicking off, the group aims to create a space for colleagues who are working in the same space to come and connect, to foster an understanding of generative AI, the opportunities and the challenges, to map out the landscape and how it's evolving across the UN system, link colleagues and expertise, and really at the heart of everything, try and avoid duplication of efforts by linking those who are working on it with others across the UN system. This group's open to anyone in the UN system, so if you're interested to learn more about generative AI and connect with those who are working on it, please join it. We'll post the link in the chat just now. And if you join, you'll get invited to regular discussions and webinars we host, both at a general as well as a more technical level. We'll invite you to things like help us map out the landscape. We'll learn more about the most promising areas in the UN system, and host deep dive discussions to really learn from others. There's some great examples from across the UN system, from DGATM, from ESCOR, from EFAD. So trying to create a space where we can learn from colleagues who have adopted generative AI already. All right, before we start, it's always nice to get a sense of who's in the room. And so we want to launch a quick poll. Now I have the challenge that I'm sharing my screen. I don't actually know where the poll feature has gone. There it is. So we would love to hear from you if you have used generative AI in your work before or privately. Let us know. We're taking a moment here. Fun story. The first time I encountered generative AI was from UNDP colleagues who wrote a silly story about Johanna using innovation in the UN system on generative AI, and I was mind blown. So that was a private encounter. Let's see. We have 67% voted. Take your pick. Yes or no? Easy question. Interesting. So we have 86% of you say that you have used ChatGPT or another platform for work or privately before. So that's really interesting. We are not super beginners here. We've all experimented, or most of us have experimented with it. That's great to hear. And today, this webinar isn't going to talk so much about the technology side, but we will talk a little bit more about the impact that generative AI will have on societies, on different sectors of society, and most importantly, on jobs. That seems to be what a lot of people are concerned with these days. We're seeing a lot of headlines and news about that. There's a lot of fear in this space. So we're very excited to tackle that question of how generative AI is impacting the quality and quantity of jobs, and learn from experts from within the UN system. So let's I never share my screen. You can tell I'm quite bad at it. So before we go to another poll, I just want to quickly tell you that we'll hear from our experts. We'll also leave plenty of room for question and answer for you to engage with them. We'll take questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Please put them there. It helps us keep track of it. Because it tends to be the most popular question, we are going to record the webinar. We're making the slides available as well as the recording, so that will all come your way after this session. And before I introduce you to our presenters, I do want to ask one more question to you that is linked to what we're about to talk. And our colleagues were wondering, what in your view is the share of all jobs in the world that could technically be fully automated with AI technology or capabilities similar to that of ChatGPT-4? We have 1 to 10, we have 11 to 30, 31 to 50, above 50% of global employment. Curious to hear what you think. And then we'll obviously let our experts answer that question for you throughout the course of the presentation. Okay, 63% answered. Last chance. Here we go. There are your results. So if this was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, you would not pick the answer based on this poll. 43% going with 11 to 30%. And then very much mixed on the rest of the answers. So let's introduce you to the people who know the answer. So I'm very happy to welcome Janine Burke, who's a senior economist at the ILO, and Pavel Gmerek, who's a senior researcher at the ILO. These two, alongside with David Viscon, are the lead authors of this ILO's very timely paper on generative AI in jobs, a global analysis of potential effects on job quality and quantity. And Janine, Pavel, thanks for joining us. We're excited to hear from you what you have uncovered as part of your research in this fast emerging space. And we're hoping to, at some point in your presentation, learn the answer on what the impact of jobs will actually be on our society. So Pavel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and thank you for having us here. We're very happy to be able to present to this group. And we will share the presentation half-half with Janine. So I'll start and then hand over. And just in the interest of time, let me just dive into it. So, the topic of technology and jobs is definitely something we have been looking at the ALO for a longer time. But it turns out also, and let me, hold on, I need to share my screen with you for a more fun experience. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. So it turns out that, of course, that's not a topic that's very new. I mean, the AI as such, yes, but technology on jobs is something that goes back into discussions far in the history, as long as we have the first industrial revolution and the first machines that appeared and started to interact with labor. Of course, we had worries about these machines, the technology affecting work. And the very first machines, like the automation of the loom and the invention of the steam engine, raised a lot of worries that eventually even went as far as workers protesting and being even violent with destroying some of the machines because of those fears. And then in the 19th century, we have further mechanization. So we have the introduction of the assembly lines and importantly, the invention of the typewriter, which somewhat links to what we are discussing today, because when typewriters were invented, there were quite many worries about them affecting clerical work and the jobs that people were doing as typical office jobs, especially when they became more popular and portable and they were more available. And in the 20th century, we have the beginning of the digital age, the invention of computers that were as big as some of our meeting rooms today, are probably bigger at the time, but were already capable enough to highlight fears, especially when they were combined with machines, usually at the time about blue-collar work, but mechanization and ability to automate processes. And if we actually look at the history of discussions at the national level, but also even internationally at the ILO, we had many discussions that reflected the type of fears, but also policies that were suggested from which we can learn today. So we basically think about it as a continuation of that discussion on technology and employment and jobs and its impact. And there are clearly some professions in the past that were impacted by technology and automated away, if we want to put it this way, jobs that used to exist in large numbers. Here you can see switchboard operators, which were crucial for connectivity. And when automation technology appeared, it was possible to remove those jobs altogether. And similar, if you think about renting DVDs in stores, for example, streaming services took away those jobs. So clearly there are jobs that can quite quickly disappear with an onset of a new technology and of new technological abilities, but there are also those jobs that either were discussed as something that could be automated. On the right, you can see a bank teller looking from the design some time in the history. And these jobs were in several studies already predicted to disappear. They didn't disappear, they actually expanded. It's just the type of work that bank tellers do expanded and changed. And on the left, you can see an airplane pilot that is a perfect example of a technology that technically, even if you could automate it fully, probably you would not be very comfortable taking that plane without any human in command. So there is also that aspect of interaction of humans with technology. And of course, since especially the launch of ChatGPT, the AI technology that was in the making for a long time came out from the lab and started interacting with many more people. So many more people were able to experiment and see how that technology, what are the capabilities of it, how it can produce output. And of course, that raised a lot of attention in the media. So when we look at the media coverage, often these days, we have discussion about replacement and enhancement, which is going to happen, which is more likely, how many jobs will be lost. And what we are asking as a question also for the discussion today is, are these really the only scenarios? Or are there other things we should actually worry about and be discussing as an impact of this technology? And we will try to show you that we argue in our paper there's much more to it than just the pure automation part. So how do we go about a study that is supposed to be global and somehow give us a global picture, which is a difficult thing to do? Well, you need to simplify many things. And one of the starting points is you have to find a common denominator for jobs. And that common denominator actually is a system that we use at the ILO. It's the International Standard Classification of Occupations, which in the most detailed form has 436 occupational groups. They're like standard groups of occupations. And you can see that at the highest level, they are organized into those 10 broad categories. So that's what we use as a starting point of our analysis. And there are tasks in the documentation of this international standard attached to those occupations. I will show you those in a second. And there are 3,123 tasks for the moment that represent typical things that a certain occupation does. So let's look at the example of primary school teachers and how we engage. Essentially, what we did in our research, we engaged the model of GPT-4, which is currently the most advanced language model, but we work with it not through the chat function that most of us are familiar with, but through the API, the back access point, so that we can loop things on a large quantity of data. You can see here, first we prompt the model. On top, you have a Python prompt that we use to understand to what extent these models have been trained on ISCO system. And you can see that if we ask it about a definition of a primary school teacher, it is actually able to predict a more detailed definition than what we have in official documentation. So we can see that these systems were trained on quite a lot of data, and they kind of seem to understand that system. Then we engage at the task level, and on the left here, you can see the tasks that are part of official documentation in that ISCO standard. And then we try to predict those for many occupations using the GPT to see to what extent GPT can understand tasks in a job. And basically, what you can see, we match them a little bit, you can see that there is a clear similarity in the way that GPT describes tasks of a primary school teacher and the way that statisticians internationally agree to describe that job or typical task that the person does. So having seen that, and having tested the model in different ways, we basically decide to rely on an AI model to help us predict at a very low level, at the task level, the possibility of technical feasibility to replace a given task, to automate it using that GPT technology. And that's important to know. We are focusing on models with the capability of GPT-4 for the moment. And you can see here how it predicts tasks, task level scores, preparing daily lesson plans. You can have a score. They go between 0 and 1. 0.6 is the score assigned to that. And you can see a justification, because we also request the model to produce a written justification of each of those scores. And you can see that for maintaining discipline and good working habits, it's a very low score. Obviously, the model doesn't seem to think that it's able to do that. And that's probably a good thing. Even if it was able to do that, probably that's not what you'd like to see happen. So we basically loop this model over all the tasks in our documentation, and we then conduct human verification of those scores. We do cross-checks, and we see whether there's consistency. And we observe a very high consistency. So certain types of tasks like typing and those things that these models are very good with, they get very high scores for basically possibility of automating them, whereas other types of tasks consistently get low scores, if you imagine, for example, manual work. So that's interesting. So the first thing we do is we take all of those tasks So 3,200 tasks more or less. And we select only those tasks that received really high scores. And we use basically a machine learning model to group them semantically. So we try to see how can we group those tasks into similarities so we understand which type of areas we can see that these tasks belong to. And you can see it's very much about administration, customer service, providing information, responding to inquiring, and processing things related to language, managing records. So that's your first indication of where these tasks that could be automated with this technology are grouping. Now, the next thing we do is we look at the distribution of those tasks. So this is a density plot at the level of individual jobs. So we take those 436 jobs, and we look in each job, how are those task scores grouped? And you can see among managers on top that the majority of the density here is in low score tasks, difficult to automate tasks, with some tasks moving to a higher automation possibility area. When you look at clerical support workers, you can see that in many jobs, many of, if not most of the tasks are in this high score zone, where theoretically with this technology, you could automate a large share of those tasks. So that gives us an indication, again, of which jobs we're talking about. And when we compare to these high-level groupings, here we can count the share of total tasks that belong to a given group that have either a medium or high-level exposure to this automation. And once again, you start to see that picture. The clerical support workers are those where a quarter of tasks that belong to those jobs are in this high exposure category, and then 60% nearly are in the medium exposure. And you don't observe that in any other jobs, but of course, technicians and professionals, some service workers, have part of their tasks there. We then calculate the scores as a mean of those task level scores and try to see again. We take 0.5, so half of the scores on the possible scale as the automation potential range, and everything above it, we treat it as medium. Everything above 0.75, we treat it as high potential. Again, you can see that when you calculate those means, you get many clerical support workers here, whereas among professionals and technicians, you can see only some of the jobs crossing that 0.5 lines. When you look at skilled agricultural work, forestry, fishery workers, you can see that most of the jobs are really in this low area. And that makes sense if you think about this technology. But then studies that do similar approaches, they go about it differently. Some of them mention, how many percent, what's the percentage of all tasks in the economy that could be automated. You can go about it from here different ways. We decided to go for really the extremes. So here's the conceptual framework that we used for it. We took the mean score of the occupation. So based on all tasks, it was the overall score of an occupation. And here we plot the standard deviation. So how these individual tasks differ from that mean. And if you separate those two extremes with some clear measures, then in this corner, you will get jobs that have a very high overall score and very little variation. These are jobs that have the highest exposure to the potential of automation. Whereas here you have jobs that have a low score, but they will have a high variation. So in general, they will have many tasks that require a human and cannot be replaced, but there'll be some tasks with a high score. Those are the jobs that we called high augmentation potential. And that is basically the conceptual framework. From here, it actually becomes interesting only once you start linking it to the question of how many such jobs are there actually around the world when you look in the different countries and into the microdata that we use. And that's where I hand over to Janine, who will take you through that part of our analysis.
Thanks, Pavel. So we have these scores for all of the occupations in the world, the 436 occupations that are used in the ISCO. And then in every country, or about 140 countries, have labor force surveys. And basically, they gather information on different people's occupations at their specific occupational codes. So we are able then to take the scores for each of the occupations and then translate that into the employment numbers. So we use the microdata for all of the countries that we have available here at the ILO. We have a microdata repository at the 4-digit level. So we don't have as many countries at the 4-digit level as we'd like to have. We have over 100 countries at the 1-digit level. We have a lot of countries at the 2-digit level, a lot of countries at the 3-digit level, and then the ones that are fewer at the 4-digit level. So what we do is basically this estimate where we cascade we basically, I won't get into it because it's a little bit complicated, but basically we just estimate what then would be the implications for these global employment numbers of how many people could potentially have, how many occupations could potentially be augmented or automated. Now, it's really important to note here that this is potential exposure. So that means that there is a job that could be automated by the technology, but the company might not decide to do so. Or it could be that even if they wanted to do so, they couldn't do so because they don't have sufficient electricity access or broadband access, or it's too expensive, or the people don't really have the skills to use their job and transform their job with the new technology. So this is very much an upper threshold of what could happen, and that's really important to think about. So let me start with the automation numbers in the lower panel here. We're looking here at the high exposure, so over 75% of an occupation's tasks are exposed to the automated potential of generative AI, or medium exposure. And what we show here is that it's mostly the high income countries that are affected. So overall in the world, 2.3% of employment, or 75 million jobs, have the potential to be automated. But if we look at that across countries, it's high income countries. Now, the reason for this here isn't because of the access to infrastructure. So that's not being considered here. This is just based on the distribution of occupations across economies. So we know that in lower income economies, they're more likely to we have more jobs that are in agriculture. You have more people who are food vendors, transport workers, and these are not jobs that can be automated by generative AI. Whereas in high income countries, you have many more people that are in the occupations that fall under the automated potential, which in most of them are the clerical workers, and then some of the other occupations as well. But then above is the potential for those jobs to be augmented. So here, what we mean by augmented is we mean transformed. It's going to be a positive thing or a negative thing, but it's basically those jobs that we're likely to have some tasks that will be changed by the technology. So that certainly could be people like ourselves, where if we start using generative AI for our work, which we did in this paper, for example, we augmented our work because we were actually able to do something would have been taken us a very long time to do by hand. We were able to do it much more efficiently by using the generative AI technology. And so there you see more of an equal distribution across countries at different levels of income. So overall for the world, 13% of employment that has the potential to be augmented. But then when we compare, low income countries, still 10.4% of jobs, high income countries, 13.4% of jobs. So there are a lot of potential there for these efficiency gains, these potential efficiency gains from the technology. Next slide. Here, what we do is we look at the share of employment by sex. So looking at all of the jobs that women have, all of the jobs that men have. We know that there are fewer women in the labor market, but that many more women are actually in clerical support jobs, which is that ISCO category that is most likely to be affected by generative AI technology. So as a result, when you look at the numbers for automation, and you look at what percentage of female jobs can potentially be automated, we have a potential automation score of 7.8%, which is 21 million jobs of women's jobs across the world, compared to 9 million jobs of men. So over 2.5% 2.5 times as much for women than men in high income countries. We see also similar differences in upper middle income countries, definitely more of a hit for women, and in lower middle income countries, not, and then the same in low income countries. But then when you look at augmentation, not too much of a difference, a little bit higher for women, probably because they're more representative in some of the these kind of the associate professional and professional positions that have that greater potential for augmentation. If you can change the next slide. But this does have some implications in terms of development, because we know that in many cases, clerical jobs are an entry point in many developing countries for women, particularly into the labor market. We know the business process outsourcing sector, for example, which is very important in the Philippines and India. This is an important employer of women. It's also an important employer of men, but relative to women's employment, it's more important for women. So this means that this potential source of kind of middle of the road job, it could likely disappear in the future because of the technology. So here what we show is the per capita income, looking at the country's per capita income, what percentage of those jobs are in each of the ISCO occupational groups by sex. And so you can see that, the orange line is women, and that the clerical support is just so much more important for women than it is for men. So that means that there's that potential then that over time, in terms of development, you will have kind of these missing jobs for women. Next slide. So turning now to our policy recommendations. So we have these, we come up with these figures, and of course there's a lot of implications for policy. One of the main findings is, we don't find a jobs apocalypse. So actually our numbers are much less than the numbers that all of you were voted on in the beginning, in the poll at the beginning of Pavel's presentation. The numbers are much less. It's not going to be all of the companies and all of the across the world that are from one day to the next that are going to adopt this technology. But there is likely to be jobs that will either disappear or they'll just very much change. And so there are certainly some people who will lose work, and that doesn't have to be something that just happens. It can be something that can be managed. So we really try to put emphasis on the importance for having, to thinking about what are the policies that we need to be putting in place, and not just and being prepared rather than just having kind of jobs disappearing and a lot of social unrest and negative consequences. So one of the most important things, and this is something that the ILO has recommended for a long time, we have this in one of our international labor standards, Convention 158, is really whenever you're going to have, especially collective dismissals, if this is let's say a large a segment of the operation of one company that's going to be automated, to prioritize redeployment and training, to see about how within an organization, people who are doing one job that could potentially be automated, could that person shift into another occupation within the organization, and avoid having the negative experience of unemployment, which we know from the literature leads to lifetime losses. So that's one really main recommendation. We talk about the need, and this is also part of that, to be engaging with workers' representatives. So trade unions here have a very important role to play, as well as competent authorities, about either averting or minimizing these terminations, or in the case of terminations, of ensuring that there is social protection in place and access to retraining for those affected workers. We know from our results that there's a strongly gendered effect from the automation, which means that one needs to keep that in mind when they're thinking about what are maybe some new professions that could be put in place, and how can we better manage this transition. And one of our recommendations, and this is basically based on the needs that we know that economies across the world have, we know there's an important transition that needs to be done because of global warming. So the green economy is really important. The care economy, there's huge shortages of care workers across the world. So these are sectors that potentially could, if a country were to increase investment in these sectors, that this could be a potential source of good quality jobs for those people that are displaced. Next slide. And then for augmentation, and this is actually probably where, in some ways, some of the policy recommendations that we focus on are actually more important, because we know that AI is transforming a lot of our daily activities in the workplace. Some of this transformation might be very positive, some of it can be negative. The important thing is to make it as positive as possible, and the important way to do that is through having dialogue really at the workplace about the incorporation of technology. So when workers participate in the implementation of technology at the workplace, not only is that technology more likely to be successful at the workplace in terms of having the outcomes in the work that you're trying to achieve at work, but it'll be done in a way that can really ensure that people's working conditions are not affected negatively. And so here what I'm talking about is the potential for some of this technology to either survey workers or to speed up work in such a way that there's a deterioration of working conditions. So this is really why it's so important that you have this social dialogue at the workplace. Now, certainly this could be done through trade unions. There's a lot of collective bargaining now that looks into collective bargaining agreements that consider how technology is implemented in the workplace. But of course, not all workplaces are unionized. So even in non-unionized workplaces, it's important to have that dialogue. It's important to have transparency and clear rules, and of course also some prohibitions as to how data can be collected and surveillance can be used. So here, for example, one of the issues is about the exercise of fundamental rights, and specifically freedom of association and collective bargaining. So if a group of workers are trying to join a trade union, there needs to be some boundaries so that, for example, if the technology were able to get wind of some sort of dialogue between workers to form a trade union, that wouldn't be a good thing, especially if it led then to some sort of retribution and dismissal of the workers. So there have to be some safeguards put in place as to how technology is used at the workplace. And the other thing is that we need to make sure that the many new jobs that are going to be created, so the numbers that we show also don't include the potential for new jobs. So in the beginning of the presentation, Pavel talked about how video rental stores have disappeared, and now we have streaming services. But at the same time, we also have mobile repair shops all over. So there's a lot of new jobs that are created when new technological systems come into place that we don't know about. So those jobs are not being accounted for. But what we want to do is make sure that these new jobs are of good quality. And so if you switch to the next slide, Pavel. One of the main jobs that is very associated with AI, and has been around now for about a decade and a half, if not 2 decades, is the important workers who train AI systems. So this is actually a photograph of a worker that we interviewed for a previous ILO report on digital labor platforms. There's hundreds of millions of workers who are involved not just in training AI systems, but in actually just getting our e-commerce systems to work, the web to work, doing all sorts of work, but very importantly, training AI systems. So they might receive a picture of a highway, and they have to put little squares around all of the cars and street lights or whatever indications there are on a highway, and that trains AI systems. And of course, large language models have been trained with workers, with online workers. And continue to be trained. So it's not a job that is going to be going away. It's not that, we're just going to train the AI systems, and then the AI systems are going to be so good and they're never going to need humans. There are some academics, Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri, who've written, they talk about automation's last mile, that you think that there's always going to be that automation will get rid of humans, but it always continues to be a human need. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, because what we've seen actually, if anything, is a growth in the number of online workers. So what about these online workers? What do we know? Some of them are employed through companies that work in large subcontracting chains for some of the big lead firms, the Googles and the other big tech firms in the world. But a lot of them but many many of them are also just working through crowdsourcing platforms. So basically you log on, you do a job, and then you get paid for the task. You get paid by the piece. These workers are not, for the most part, are not being classified as employees. They're classified as independent contractors, and they're paid by the piece. So earnings are very low. Studies that we've done and that others have done show that they're around $2 an hour. So while this is a potential for a new jobs that could replace some of these clerical jobs that could be lost, they're not very good jobs. So what we need here is some policies to make sure that these jobs could be really of decent quality. And so at the ILO in 2025 and 2026, there was a decision taken by the ILO constituents to have a discussion on this issue of workers in the platform economy. So this includes the online workers, but also workers who operate in place, such as Uber drivers and delivery drivers and so forth. So this is the whole kind of platform economy. So luckily, the constituents have decided to have this discussion, and so we will have some international guidance on how to have norm standards in place for these workers in the future. If you could change to the next slide. Okay, so the other kind of big policy area, it really relates to the digital divide. So we know that there is this potential. I mean, I've talked about perhaps more of the negative potential effects of technology, but there also could be very important productivity effects. And I think the work that we were able to do more quickly is a testament to that. Yet there are so many parts of the world where people are not on the internet. And I think we all know that, but it's sometimes useful to be reminded of the numbers of, this is the share of population not using internet. And you see that, in some parts of Africa and Asia, you have people, over 50% of the population that still are not even on the internet at all. So this is something, this whole digital divide that exists among countries means that the productivity enhancing effects of this technology might just be limited to the richer countries, unless more effort can be done by the international community to ensure access to broadband. Of course, also electricity access still is a huge constraint. Next slide. So yeah, so that's all for our presentation. We thought that maybe it would be useful to have a good technology, a good discussion about how you see generative AI could possibly impact the work that you do. And then also more broadly, as the UN, what type of policies do you think are required to support member states? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janine, and thank you, Pavel. Fascinating presentation. I am still sometimes haunted by my econometric classes at night, so I never thought that I would enjoy talks of standard deviation and means, and find them very interesting. So thanks for cleaning that trauma, and I love that you use generative AI to do this report. Very innovative use. So we would love to open up for discussion. We also have a bunch of questions for you that I'd love to put to you. Everyone, we're collecting questions in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. Please put them in there and do upvote questions that you find interesting to make sure that we're asking the most relevant ones. And we will also try and give you the floor to ask the questions yourself. I'm going to start with, we just got upvoted. So I was going to go to Christina in New York, but now we're going to Kwok, I believe, from UNICEF in Malaysia. Kwok, do you want to come and ask your question yourself?
Hi, sure. I hope I'm audible. Yeah. So my question is basically on the analysis. Just wondering if there is also an age dimension to the analysis, because we know that clerical work are usually for entry level, which are primarily occupied by fresh grads and younger employees. So could that be an implication on youth employment or youth job loss coming from generative AI? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we take them one by one or a few together? What's your preference? Let's go one by one. So, Janine, Pavel, what are your thoughts?
I think that's a good point. I think there probably is an age dimension in that respect. There's still a lot of clerical workers that are not young people, so I'd have to look precisely at the numbers. I mean, that's something that we could do, I think, pretty easily. But it might be the case that in some countries that those workers are definitely younger, so they would be more likely to be automated. The one benefit of youth, though, is that they tend to have better digital skills, so they're more likely to be able to work with the technology in those occupations that are being transformed by it. So in that respect, I think youth have that advantage.
Great, thank you. Building on the age dimension question, I think we'll pass it over to Christina for a question on gender differentiation.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I did put a question in the chat. Why is there a gender differentiation at all? And maybe just to explain a little bit, I mean, it's fairly obvious that any kind of demographic insight that can be gained when you're doing large scale studies, of course, can be very helpful. But when I was looking at the data that you were sharing, I wasn't quite sure I was understanding it in the gender dimension, because if I recall the slide correctly, at the high income level, women seem to be impacted more than men for automation.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was looking also at the statistics associated with skilled agricultural and fishery and forestry, you know, I just wondered, like, what do you see as the core drivers here? Is it more about the way the work is distributed amongst the genders, or does it have to do with complex decision making? Because that's another interesting anomaly about the skilled agriculture, forestry, fisher workers, is that they are less impacted perhaps than others. So having grown up on a farm, you do take very complex decisions, honestly, in order to cultivate the ecosystem. So I just wondered if there was any insight on the gender aspect and why it seems even at the high income level, it impacts women more than men for automation, because I wouldn't have guessed that. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's basically labor jobs are segregated. So you tend to have women in certain occupations and men in certain occupations. So for transport jobs, for example, 97% of transport workers are men in the world. And then there's, you know, let's say the care sector, nurses, 2/3 in the world are women. So you just have this concentration of you know, this basically sex segregation by occupation, and you have many more women that are in clerical jobs, and it's clerical jobs that have the greatest potential for automation.
Even at the high income level?
Even at high income level. So if
Especially-
you look at, if you're going to go look at the data in the United States, for example, you have many, many more women in all of those occupations that could be affected by, that are potentially exposed to automation. So the skilled forestry workers, they're not, you know, they have some tasks that they do that maybe could be aided by generative AI, but they're nothing, you know, they're not disappearing or potentially disappearing by this technology. But the ones that could have more potential to be automated are in those positions where you tend to have more women. So it's not about decision making. It's about, yeah, I mean,
it's just puzzling, because the implication is that there's a lot of high income women who are doing
it's not high income
automatable tasks.
These are high income countries. High income countries, upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, low income countries.
Thank you.
Sorry, I thought that was
really
clear.
helps.
Yeah, no, this is the World Bank classification of income groups. And that's a reflection of the diversification of the economy. So a high income, you know, if you think of a high income country, there you have an entertainment sector, a finance sector, real estate. So you have more jobs because of their economic structure that have the potential to be automated.
Thank you so much for explaining.
And sorry, not having clear labels.
No, but I think we're clear on labels, Jen, no?
The labels are good.
I think if I could add to this quickly, I think this slide that Janine showed, and that high income dimension of countries is really what explains, and that gender effect is a question we very often get. And what you can see here is basically like this development path. So imagine that a country of low income is here, and then it starts moving up here as income grows. And you can see what happens when you put across the countries the share of jobs. You can see these elementary occupations decreasing very fast. But then you can see the segregation among professionals. More women go into those jobs. Among clerical support workers, you see more women than men. Among service and sales workers, you again see more women than men as a share of employment. So basically, these are also happen to be the categories where generative AI in the form that it has today has the potential to have the highest impact. So when you take the jobs in those categories, you will get more women. And what happens with the increase in income of countries is you have also increase in access to technology that drives the possibilities of applying this technology. So infrastructure behind it, access to internet, the type of work where you spend more time, maybe in a clerical job in a low-income countries, you spend more time doing logistics and doing other things, not only in front of your computer screen. In a high-income country, you spend more time really in the office doing office-like work and a lot of interaction with a computer and with a computer that's connected to the internet. That's already what makes a difference. And there are simply many more jobs like that in a high-income country than in a low-income country, which is something you can see. Clerical support workers in low-income countries, as a share of employment, are very low. In a high-income country, they reach around 15% of the employment share. So that's where this gender difference is also coming from.
I can imagine, Pavel and Janine, that the gender question is one that comes up constantly. And thanks, Christina, for asking and allowing us the deep dive. I would like to piggyback with a question from anonymous colleague, and they were saying 48 million female jobs automated actually sounds much lower than expected. Did it also surprise you that that number was relatively low, or were you expecting it to be within that range? And yeah, any thoughts on that? What would be driving this?
Do you want to take it, Pavel, or you want me to?
Well, I can start, we can share.
Okay.
Or do you want to start?
Okay, fine, I'll start. So it's a good question. I mean, I let's just say I was pleasantly relieved. I didn't expect a jobs apocalypse, because even if a lot of times things that appear to be automated have human labor behind them, that's one thing. And then there's always this transformation of the way people do their tasks. You know, occupations tasks always transform. And so we know this historically, that there's always this kind of transformation. So no, I don't think it wasn't less than I thought it would be. 40 million sounds much lower. Yeah, no, it wasn't much lower, but go ahead, Pavel.
No, to me it was a bit of surprise. But I think when we started, like, you know, when you produce this graph for the first time, it's like developing a film, a photo from a traditional camera, where it starts appearing because you put together these tasks and these scores and so on, and then you get this graph first time, and you're like, whoa, okay, maybe it should be higher. But then you start decomposing this result, and you start to think about it, and exactly what Janine said. I mean, there's the transformation of jobs. So what we're looking at it here is jobs as they are reported in official statistics as of today, existing jobs, and the feasibility of automating a job fully with the current GPT possibilities. And I think it's the Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, Hungarian philosopher, who says that we can do more than we can express. And that's part of this non-paradox. We're looking at just standard tasks for these jobs. And within those jobs already, the models and our assessments show us that there are always things in those jobs, even if you look at standardized tasks, that you cannot automate away. Even if there's 1-2 tasks that require a human, you won't automate that job fully. So that's number one. And the second part is that generation of new tasks that is not discussed here at all, which is, imagine when these typewriters we discussed were introduced, or when email appeared. Before, people had someone type maybe a letter for them. Then you were asked to type it yourself. Using email and having to type messages became a new task that many jobs had to take on. Documenting things on their computers are tasks that were integrated with technology. So that is also going to be part of it. And a job doesn't just disappear entirely that easily, it turns out. In some cases, if it's a really limited set of tasks, it can happen, but you will have that expansion. But even if we take those jobs today, there are, I think, those two dimensions. One is there are not that many jobs where you have majority of tasks that you can comfortably say, we're going to automate it away, especially if you take into account technical constraints, technological, economic constraints, relative cost of labor to technology, of implementation, and all the problems that come actually with implementing those tools in reality for them to function 100% well, which is at which point you would feel comfortable not having a human. And then there are just not that many such jobs in the global economy, because these jobs are also a larger share in wealthy countries, whereas in low-income countries, it's different type of jobs, and those different jobs have many other tasks that have little to do with what you can automate with a language model as of today.
Let me just add one thing also. We're only looking at generative AI. So there's other technologies that could be automating some robotics that would not be included in this analysis.
Great, thank you. On to the next question. So we have an anonymous colleague who asked comparative question. The question is, how do your findings relate to some of the other estimates you've seen from other sources?
Oh, I'm waiting for you to take that one.
Okay, I can. There aren't really many global estimates done in the same way. So if you look, there are those methodological constraints, and that is probably where we got also a lot of attention from to our study, because we're using a system, this ISCO system, and ILO statistics is quite a unique source from which you can draw a global picture. And when you put the low-income countries and the regional specificities, and you do those estimates, you get a result that if you were to compare it to some other studies that came out recently, will be probably percentage-wise a bit lower. Some studies looking at the US market exclusively will provide you higher figures. But also there's a question of how these things are counted. So we really focused on possibility of automating a job away or augmenting those jobs. Many of those studies will provide you statistics that go somewhere along 50% of tasks in 40% of jobs could be automated away tomorrow. It's interesting, but it doesn't really give you the same type of pictures. So we went with this type of analysis, and that's, I think, the comparison. So if you read other papers, I think you will find more of presentation of statistics like that when they go to tell you what is the share of tasks in how many jobs that exist in that country that could be automated away. But that doesn't give you the separation between full automation and transformation, which is where we focused, because that also informs our policy recommendations. So I think that's another part of it. Our study gives you this global overview with those gendered effects. I think that's the first global study that also showed that strong gender effect. There were some national studies in high-income countries that suggested that before, but here it comes out clearly, and that gendered effect is very clearly linked to income level. So you can see that the gender effect actually grows with income level for the reasons we discussed. So that would be probably the best comparison I can do quickly to the literature, but maybe Janine, you have more on this.
No, I think that's pretty complete.
Thank you. This is great. Thanks so much for sharing that. Because we're rapidly running out of time and there are so many questions in here still. So I just want to take a few rapid fire ones and then maybe suggest that we answer some of the ones we might not get to today on the unit team space. So maybe you can lend a few more minutes there after the webinar. But just in terms of, really rapid fire, very short answers. Murad from UNODC in Vienna is asking, what's the time frame for the 13% of augmentation number that you're quoting? And Pavel from UNICEF in New York is wondering, is robotization included as your automation definition? So just rapidly hearing these, please.
I can pick the time frame one. There is no time frame for this analysis. It's looking at a kind of a picture of, a static picture of the jobs that exist right now. What is the potential exposure to the technology? And I think it's really, really, really important to keep this potential exposure clear. We're not saying whatever that, if you look at it here, we're not saying 7.21 million jobs of women in high income countries are going to disappear by tomorrow. Some of this automation will not happen, and a lot of it will happen slowly, and because it happens slowly, people will transition to other jobs, or it just happens and then people get other jobs. So it's not something that you want to think of as kind of a one day to the next. I think the only time you've ever seen anything happen one day to the next was during the COVID pandemic. That was like the biggest shock. As a labor economist, we're seeing something really happen like that. And this isn't the same case here. And of course, it depends very much on policies. So it really depends, are there going to be discussions about transitions? Is there going to be investment into new sectors that people could actually move into kind of seamlessly without having to lose jobs and have kind of higher unemployment? So that's, yeah.
Great. So no timeline there to answer that question. Robotization included as in your automation definition, Pavel? Yes or no? We need quick answers here.
No, no, in a sense that most of the tasks performed here, we were really focused on language models and generative AI of this type. Great. So for the moment, the way these neural networks have been used, they haven't really been that much applied to training of robots, or not at mass scale, but that could be next capability that they will develop, and that is something that is not part of the study. And just a quick addition on the timelines, it's very tricky to add timelines, and we really don't want to do that because they become quite embarrassing when they mature and you are really far off the mark for many reasons that we can't control, and there are so many studies like that. We think it's much more important to have a study that focuses the attention of the policymakers on what is the direction of the shift and what should be the policies to respond. Where should the attention go and how to go about it, rather than take those figures and quote them as something super firm that we believe will happen tomorrow.
Very important reminder. Thanks for that. Questions just keep on coming in. We will try and take them offline in the team space, maybe include in the send out. There's a bunch of questions around governing bodies, which I find quite interesting. There's a lot on training, which has some resources that we have. But I want to ask one more again, for a quick one from McDonald, based at UNOPS in Denmark. And they're wondering, would you say the number of jobs that will be lost will be proportionate to the number of new jobs that will be created? Definitely not an easy question to answer, but the last one before we hand over to Fiona to wrap us up.
Yeah, not an easy question. And it's a little bit kind of in the lines of Pavel said that, you can risk embarrassment. So I don't want to be dismissive of the potential for people to lose their job, because obviously every individual that loses a job, it's a very traumatic experience. But this is not what keeps me awake at night, that there's going to be this mass job loss. I'm more concerned about the job quality aspect of really how AI affects our lives, both at work, but also obviously outside of work, and then democracy and so forth. We're not going to get into that now, but those I think are some of the more bigger pressing issues. So one of the reasons why we wrote this paper is that because we wanted to, although the paper is really more of a quantitative paper on the quantitative effects of the technology, to really bring attention to the potential quality effects, because working conditions is something that affects everybody every day to day, and it has huge consequences on your life. And I think that we need to bring attention to that. And then of course we need to make sure that whatever new jobs are created are good quality jobs. And with this kind of the virtual work and the global work that we have nowadays, it's much more difficult to regulate because regulation continues to be national. Our economies are very global. So just to bring attention to how kind of regulation in the workplace needs to change to ensure that the quality of all these new jobs being created is good.
Great. Thank you so much, Janine and Pavel. I think we're at time. So thank you for this deep dive into your paper and taking the time to share your perspectives on generative AI and jobs more broadly. Really looking forward to continuing this conversation offline. So just quickly to participants, I know that we're at time here, so I'll be very quick. I'm sure we all have to hop on another meeting. But I did want to flag that we do have another generative AI practice group session November 6th. So that's this coming Monday. We're delighted to invite Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI for a conversation on global trends in AI. So they'll do a deep dive into their recent 2023 AI index report. And they're also going to have a strong focus on the generative AI landscape in particular. So not just the AI landscape more broadly. And they'll also speak to the Institute's take on transparency and what an AI transparency ecosystem looks like. So I'll submit the RSVP link in the chat. I did also want to flag that we're inviting them for a second webinar to the data community. So please feel free to join either or both. The second webinar is going to have a stronger focus on the data aspect in the AI landscape space. So I'll link them both in the chat and looking forward to continuing the conversations with everyone. Thank you for joining us today.